The rain wasn't just rain. It was a cold, liquid judgment. Each drop that hit the back of my neck felt like a tiny, insistent tap reminding me how exposed I was, suspended 60 feet in the air in a rattling metal cage. Below, the courtyard of the Citadel of the Redeemer was a slick, black mirror reflecting a bruised purple sky. The city's noise was a distant, muffled roar, lost beneath the hiss of the downpour and the angry buzz of failing electronics in my hands. My fingers, numb inside soaked leather gloves, fumbled with a delicate glass tube. This was my penance, my job, my whole life distilled into one miserable Tuesday afternoon, fixing a rich church's broken halo. The neon cross was famous, a landmark visible from the interstate. For generations, it had blazed a relentless, electric blue against the skyline. Now, the horizontal bar flickered erratically, one side dead, giving the holy symbol a lopsided, wounded look. It felt appropriate, somehow. A perfect metaphor for the promises the world made and the fractured way it delivered them. My work was to restore the illusion of perfection. I was a specialist in old signs, a dying trade, which meant I got the jobs no one else wanted or knew how to do. Jobs like this one, dangling over a precipice in a storm that had no intention of letting up. I had been up here for 3 hours. The wind rocked the hydraulic lift with a gut-swooping rhythm, and the cold had seeped deep into my bones, a damp and weary ache that settled behind my knees. I lived a life of careful routines, of budgeting down to the last dollar, of keeping my head down and my heart locked away. My small apartment was my fortress, a place of quiet solitude where the only expectations were my own. Out here, I was just a service provider, a temporary fix for a permanent institution. The Citadel didn't care about Leo Thorne. It cared about its immaculate, glowing brand. I had known of Julian Croft for years, in the way you know about local royalty. He was the only son of the Reverend Dr. Alastair Croft, the man who had built this citadel from a modest parish into a global media empire. Julian was the quiet shadow behind the blinding spotlight of his father. I'd see him sometimes, crossing the manicured grounds, always dressed in simple, well-made clothes that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. He moved with a stillness that was unnerving in a world that demanded constant motion. There was a gravity to him, a self-contained quiet that I, from my own fortress of solitude, found myself watching, longing for. It was a foolish, pointless ache, the kind you keep in a sealed jar on a high shelf. Today, that ache was just another layer of discomfort. I was focused on the transformer, trying to shield it from the worst of the rain with my own body as I tested the connections. A flicker of movement below caught my eye. A figure had emerged from a side door of the sprawling ministry complex, holding a large black umbrella that seemed laughably inadequate against the deluge. It was him, Julian Croft. He stood at the edge of the safety cordon I'd set up, his head tilted back, watching me. I couldn't make out his expression from this height, but the sheer act of him standing there, in the soaking rain, felt significant. Most clients stayed inside. They wrote the check and expected results, uninterested in the messy process. He didn't move for a long time. He just stood, a solitary, unmoving shape in the swirling gray. I tried to ignore him, to focus on the delicate dance of wires and voltage. But the weight of his gaze was a physical thing. It was different from the indifferent stares of passers-by. It felt attentive. I risked another glance down. He was still there, his posture unchanged. I felt a flush of something hot, an unwelcome crawl up my neck. It was the shame of being seen like this, drenched, cold, clinging to a swaying piece of machinery. A stray cat caught in a storm. After another 10 minutes, when my hands were so cold I could barely feel the wire strippers, he finally moved. He walked to the base of the lift and looked up, his face now clear. He wasn't wearing the smooth, pastoral mask of his father. His expression was one of simple, unadorned concern. The lines around his eyes were etched with it. He didn't shout over the wind. He just waited until my eyes met his. Then, his voice carried up, low and calm, cutting through the noise of the storm. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. "Come down from there," he said. The words were simple, direct. "Come inside and warm up for a moment." I just stared. The world had conditioned me to expect transactions. An offer like that, from a man like him, had to have a price. Pity maybe. Or worse, a kind of charitable condescension that would feel colder than the rain. But his eyes held none of that. They were just steady, waiting. I had two choices: stay up here and preserve my lonely, miserable pride, or accept a moment of grace. My shivering hands made the decision for me. I couldn't feel my fingertips. I gave a stiff, jerky nod and began the slow, grinding descent. The journey down felt like an eternity. With every foot the lift lowered, my anxiety grew. What would I say? What did he want? The cage landed with a soft hydraulic sigh on the wet stone. I fumbled with the latch, my movements clumsy and stiff. When the gate swung open, he was there, holding the umbrella over the entrance. He didn't rush me, just stood patiently as I gathered my tools with shaking hands and stepped onto solid ground. The rain immediately stopped drumming on my hard hat, the sudden quiet under the umbrella disorienting. "Thank you," I mumbled, the words feeling thick and useless in my mouth. "It's a brutal day to be out in this," he said. His voice was even warmer up close, a low baritone that seemed to absorb the chill. "My office is just through here. There's coffee." He gestured with his head toward the side door he'd come from. It led to a part of the complex that looked older, made of dark stone rather than the modern glass and steel of the main sanctuary. He didn't wait for an answer, just started walking, assuming I would follow. And I did. I felt like a stray animal being led to shelter, and I hated the feeling, but the promise of warmth was too strong to resist. The door opened into a quiet, wood-paneled hallway. The air inside was warm and dry and smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and something else, something clean and subtle, like fresh linen. It was the smell of a well-kept peace. The sound of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a gentle tapping against thick, leaded glass windows. Julian closed the door behind us, shutting out the world I was so used to fighting against. The silence he created was profound. "Leave your wet gear here," he said, pointing to a rubber mat by the door. "It'll dry." I stripped off my soaked jacket, gloves, and hard hat, my movements still clumsy. I felt exposed in my thin, damp work shirt. He took his own coat off, revealing a simple gray sweater over a collared shirt. He was taller than I'd realized, with a solid build that spoke of quiet strength, not gym-sculpted vanity. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than old. I guessed he was in his late 40s, maybe 15 years my senior. It was an intimidating gap, another wall between his world and mine. His office was at the end of the hall. It was nothing like I'd imagined. There were no grand mahogany desks or pictures of him shaking hands with important people. It was a library, a sanctuary. Bookshelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling, filled with books of all kinds: leather-bound classics, modern paperbacks, art histories, technical manuals. A comfortable-looking leather armchair and a sofa faced a low coffee table. In one corner, a simple desk held a laptop and a neat stack of papers. The only light came from two soft lamps, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. It was a space designed for thinking, for quiet. It was a reflection of the man himself. "Please," he said, gesturing to the armchair. "Sit. I'll get that coffee." He disappeared through another door, which I assumed led to a small kitchenette. I stood awkwardly in the middle of the room for a moment, feeling like an intruder. My muddy boots had left faint marks on the polished hardwood floor. I was a disruption in this orderly, peaceful world. But the armchair looked so inviting, its leather worn and soft. I sank into it, and my whole body sighed in relief. The deep chill in my bones began to recede, replaced by a creeping, unfamiliar comfort. I listened to the quiet sounds from the other room: the clink of ceramic, the gurgle of a coffee machine, the soft thud of a cabinet closing. These were domestic sounds, ordinary sounds, but in this context, they felt extraordinary. They were sounds of care. He wasn't having an assistant do this. He was doing it himself. It was a small detail, but it chipped away at the image I had built of him in my mind. He returned with two heavy ceramic mugs, steam rising from them in fragrant clouds. He placed one on a coaster on the table in front of me and took the other to the sofa opposite. He sat, not with a formal stiffness, but with a relaxed ease, as if he had all the time in the world. As if my presence was not an interruption to his day. "Black, 2 sugars?" he asked. I blinked, startled. "How did you?" A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his face, softening the serious lines. "I asked Maria at the front desk how you took it. when you checked in this morning. I figured you might need it later, my mind reeled. He had planned this. This small act of kindness wasn't spontaneous. It was premeditated. He had seen the weather forecast, known I would be working in it, and prepared. The thought was so foreign, so deeply unexpected, that I didn't know how to respond. The carefully constructed walls of my cynicism began to show cracks. Pity felt different from this. This felt like consideration. Thank you, I said again, my voice a little hoarse. I picked up the mug. The warmth seeped into my palms, a grounding, solid heat. It was the best cup of coffee I had ever tasted. We sat in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a comfortable, breathing space. He wasn't pressing me with questions, wasn't trying to fill the air with small talk. He just drank his coffee and watched me, his gaze gentle and assessing. I felt like a complex circuit he was quietly trying to understand. I tried to read his expression, but it was placid, calm. He was a man who had mastered the art of stillness. The transformer is shot, I said, finally, needing to fill the silence with the one thing we officially had in common, my work. And there's a short in the primary tube on the left arm. I can bypass it to get the rest of the bar lit for now, but it'll need a new custom-bent piece. Might take a week or two to fabricate, he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. Whatever it takes. We want it done right, not fast. Your company came highly recommended. They said you were the best with historical fixtures. Praise from a man like him felt different. It wasn't just a compliment. It was a validation that landed with a surprising weight. I try to be, I said, looking down into my coffee. You shouldn't go back up today, he said. It wasn't a suggestion. The forecast says this is settling in for the night. You can finish the bypass tomorrow morning. We'll pay for the full day, of course. I opened my mouth to argue, to insist on finishing the temporary fix, to prove my worth and my resilience. It was an old instinct, the need to work harder, to push through discomfort, to never be seen as weak or wanting. But the simple, non-negotiable care in his tone stopped me. He wasn't firing me. He was protecting me. The realization sent a strange, warm flutter through my chest. Okay, I agreed, the word coming out softer than I intended. He gave a small, satisfied nod. Good. He leaned forward to place his mug on the table, and the sleeve of his sweater brushed against my knee. The contact was brief, accidental, a feather-light touch of warm cashmere. But it sent a jolt through my entire system. It was the first gentle, human touch I'd felt in longer than I could remember. My breath hitched, and I quickly looked away, hoping he hadn't noticed my reaction. A deep, burning blush crept up my neck. I was pathetic. A simple, meaningless touch, and I was falling apart. When I dared to look back at him, his expression was unchanged, but his eyes seemed to hold a new depth, a flicker of understanding. He knew. He had felt it too, or at least, he had seen its effect on me. But he didn't pull away or act embarrassed. He just let the moment hang in the air between us, a silent, shared acknowledgement. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. It was no longer just a wealthy client and a hired worker. It was something else, something infinitely more complicated and terrifying and hopeful. I stayed for another hour. We talked, but not about anything important. We talked about the books on his shelves, about the history of the old building we were in, about the stubbornness of old wiring. The conversation was easy, unforced. He was a good listener, asking questions that showed he was actually hearing my answers. He asked about my work, not just this job, but the craft itself. He was curious about the art of bending glass, the science of charging it with noble gases. He made me feel like an artisan, not just a repairman. And I watched him. I watched the way his hands moved when he talked, careful and deliberate. I watched the way the lamplight caught the silver in his hair. I watched the way his eyes would soften when he smiled. I was gathering details, hoarding them like treasures. I was building a new image of Julian Croft, one that had nothing to do with his famous father or his family's fortune. This man was quiet and kind and attentive, and he was looking at me in a way that made me feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. When the rain finally lessened to a steady drizzle, I knew it was time to go. The warmth of the room had made me drowsy, comfortable. Too comfortable. I stood up, the spell breaking. I should go, I said, my voice sounding rough. Thank you for the coffee. For this, I gestured vaguely at the room, at the warmth and quiet. It's the least I could do, he said, standing as well. Drive carefully. The roads will be slick. He walked me back to the hallway where my damp jacket was still hanging. As I pulled it on, the cold, wet fabric was a shock against my warm skin. It was a reminder of the world I was returning to, a world without quiet libraries and gentle, considerate men. I was putting my armor back on. At the door, I paused, my hand on the handle. I had to ask, why? The word was small, barely a whisper. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. I saw a man doing a dangerous job in dangerous weather, he said simply. And I wanted to make sure he was all right. His answer was so direct, so devoid of artifice, that it disarmed me completely. He wasn't trying to gain anything. He was just being decent. It was a concept so rare in my experience that it felt like a miracle. Thank you, Julian, I said, using his first name for the first time. It felt both strange and perfectly natural on my tongue. He smiled again, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. You're welcome, Leo. I'll see you in the morning. He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. I was a contractor. But hearing him say it, in that low, warm voice, made it sound like something more than just a label on an invoice. It sounded like something he had taken the time to learn, something he intended to use again. The next morning, the sky was a clean, washed-out blue. The air was crisp and cool. When I arrived, Julian was already waiting for me in the courtyard, holding 2 takeaway cups of coffee. He was dressed in jeans and a thick, dark green sweater, and he looked less like the son of a billionaire magnate and more like a university professor on his day off. He handed me one of the cups. It was black, with 2 sugars. Figured you could use this before you go up, he said. You didn't have to do that, I said, my cheeks growing warm despite the morning chill. I wanted to, he replied easily. This became our new routine. For the next week, while I worked on the cross, first installing the bypass, then carefully removing the broken glass tube, and finally waiting for the new one to be fabricated, Julian was a quiet, steady presence. He didn't hover, didn't supervise. He would bring me coffee in the morning, and then leave me to my work. But he would often appear around lunchtime, not with an invitation, but with a simple statement. I'm heading to the cafe on the corner. They have a good roast beef sandwich, and I would find myself packing up my tools and joining him. We ate at a small table in the corner of a noisy cafe, 2 men from different universes sharing a simple meal. He never once offered to pay for my food. It was a subtle, respectful gesture that I appreciated more than he could ever know. He was intentionally avoiding any action that could be misconstrued as charity, anything that would emphasize the financial chasm between us. He was treating me as an equal, a colleague, a friend. During those lunches, I learned more about him. He managed the Croft Foundation, the charitable arm of the family empire, but he ran it from his quiet library office, deliberately keeping himself separate from the politics and pageantry of the Citadel itself. He had a degree in art history, which explained the books in his office. He spoke quietly about his work, about funding arts programs in underserved schools and preserving historical buildings. He never spoke about his father, and I never asked. We existed in a small, self-contained bubble of our own making. I found myself opening up to him in ways I never did with anyone. I told him about growing up in a series of foster homes, about learning my trade from an old sign maker in Chicago who had taken me under his wing. I told him about the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life, of seeing the light flicker on for the first time. He listened intently, his gaze never wavering. He made me feel that my small, quiet life was a story worth telling. One afternoon, I was in his office, going over the schematics for the new tube on his laptop. The space had become a familiar comfort to me, a refuge from the world. He was sitting on the sofa, reading, while I worked at his desk. A comfortable silence stretched between us, punctuated by the soft click of my mouse and the whisper of a turning page. It must be difficult, he said suddenly, his voice pulling me from my concentration. I looked up. What's that? He had put his book down and was looking at me, his expression serious. Dealing with people like us. The church board. The administration. They can be a lot, I shrugged, a defensive instinct. It's just a job. I keep it professional, I know you do, he said softly. But I've seen the way some of them look at you. At us. When we're together, my stomach tightened. I had noticed it too. The curious glances, the whispers from the administrative staff when I passed them in the hall. I had been trying to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening. But Julian saw it all. He missed nothing. He got up from the sofa and came to stand near the desk, leaning against the edge of it. He was close enough that I could smell that faint, clean scent of his, like fresh air after a storm. "I want you to know," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "that your presence here, in this office, is at my invitation. It has nothing to do with the church or your contract. If it ever makes you uncomfortable, if anyone ever says anything to you, you tell me." Immediately, he was drawing a line in the sand. He was protecting me, not just from the weather, but from the social complexities of his world. He was creating a safe space and defending its borders. It was the most profoundly caring thing anyone had ever done for me. "Why are you being so good to me?" The question slipped out, raw and vulnerable, before I could stop it. It was the question that had been haunting me for days. He looked down at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes beyond quiet consideration. I saw a flicker of the same yearning I felt, the same deep, unspoken loneliness. He reached out, his movement slow and deliberate, and placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm and solid, a steadying weight. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was an anchor. "Because," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think you're a good man, Leo. And I enjoy your company more than I have enjoyed anyone's in a very long time." My breath caught in my throat. The air in the room grew thick, charged with everything that had been left unsaid between us for the past week. His thumb stroked my shoulder, a small, repetitive motion that sent a wave of heat through my entire body. This was it, the moment where everything could change or everything could shatter. I lift my gaze to meet his. I am no longer just an employee. He is no longer just a client. We are two men, standing on the edge of a discovery. The quiet foundation that has been settling between us for days is now ready to bear weight. This is the moment to speak, to open the long-locked door. "I enjoy your company too, Julian," I say, and my own voice sounds foreign, full of a hope I had forgotten I was capable of feeling. He holds my gaze for a long moment, searching for something in my eyes. He must have found it, because that soft, slow smile I had come to cherish appeared on his face. He gave my shoulder one last, gentle squeeze before he pulled his hand away. The loss of his touch was an immediate ache. "The new tube arrives tomorrow," he said, his voice back to its normal, calm register, but with a new warmth underlying it. "One more day, one more day?" The words hung in the air, a promise and a threat. One more day of this strange, wonderful limbo. And then what? The job would be done. My reason for being here would be gone. The thought sent a spike of pure panic through me. I couldn't lose this. I couldn't go back to the way things were before. The next day was a torture of precision and anxiety. The installation of the new neon tube had to be perfect. The glass was fragile, the connections precise. I worked with a focus that bordered on obsession, my movements economical and sure. But my mind was a whirlwind. Every time I glanced down from the lift, I half expected to see him there, watching. But he wasn't. He left me alone all day. There was no coffee, no invitation for lunch. I told myself it was for the best. He was giving me space to work, respecting my professionalism. But a colder, more familiar voice in my head whispered that he had changed his mind. That last night's moment of near confession had scared him off. That he had realized the foolishness of bridging the gap between our worlds. By the time I was ready to power up the sign for the final test, my hands were shaking, and it had nothing to do with the height. I descended in the lift, my heart pounding a heavy, dread-filled rhythm against my ribs. I walked over to the main breaker box, my boots echoing in the now empty courtyard. It was late afternoon, and the sky was beginning to fade to a deep indigo. This was the moment of truth, in more ways than one. I took a deep breath and flipped the switch. There was a low hum, and then, high above me, the cross blazed to life. It was perfect, a steady, brilliant, unbroken blue, casting its ethereal glow down onto the stones below. A symbol of faith, restored by a man who had none. I had done my job. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. It was over. "It's beautiful," I spun around. Julian was standing in the shadows by the door to his office, his arms crossed over his chest. I hadn't even heard him approach. He stepped forward into the blue light, and it painted his face in shades of sapphire and shadow. "You did incredible work, Leo," he said. "It's what I do," I replied, my voice flat. I started gathering my tools, needing to keep my hands busy. I'll just pack up my gear. The invoice will be sent to the main office. I was all business now, rebuilding the walls he had so patiently dismantled. It was safer that way. Leo, his voice stopped me. It was quiet, but it held a command I couldn't ignore. I slowly turned back to face him. Don't, he said softly. Don't do that. Do what? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. Retreat, he said. Don't retreat from me. He closed the distance between us until he was only a few feet away. The blue light from the cross above bathed us, creating an isolated, otherworldly stage. The rest of the world, the busy city, the politics of the church, it all faded away. There was only the hum of the neon and the steady presence of the man in front of me. The job is done, Julian, I said, my voice tight. There's no reason for me to be here anymore, isn't there? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I can think of one. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't speak. I could only stand there, vulnerable and exposed under his gentle gaze. I don't want this to be the end of seeing you, he said, his voice low and clear and full of a feeling that stole the air from my lungs. It wasn't a question. It was a confession, a simple, honest declaration that laid his own heart bare. And in that moment, all my fear, all my cynicism, all the years of telling myself I was better off alone, it all crumbled to dust. He had stepped across the chasm first. He was waiting for me on the other side. I don't want it to be, either, I whispered. The words felt like they were pulled from the deepest part of my soul. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile of pure relief. He took one more step, closing the final gap between us. He raised his hand, not to my shoulder this time, but to my face. His fingers were warm as they gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking the rough stubble on my cheek. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, it made my knees feel weak. Good, he breathed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I leaned in to meet him, my eyes fluttering shut. His lips were soft, warm, and hesitant at first, a gentle question. I answered by pressing back, a silent confirmation. The kiss was not a firestorm of passion. It was something better. It was a quiet homecoming. It was the feeling of a key sliding into a lock you thought you'd lost forever. It was slow and deep, and it tasted of coffee and honesty and the cool night air. It was a promise of warmth, a shelter from the storm. It was right, utterly and completely right. When we finally broke apart, he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the cold air. His hand was still on my cheek, a warm, grounding presence. I reached up and covered his hand with my own, lacing our fingers together. So, I said, my voice shaky but light. What happens now? He chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated through his chest and into mine. Now, he said, his lips brushing against mine as he spoke. I believe we go inside, and I make us some dinner. The night that followed was a blur of quiet domesticity that felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture could have. We didn't fall into bed. Instead, we stood side by side in his small, efficient kitchen, the one attached to his library office. He cooked a simple pasta dish, and I chopped vegetables, our movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. We talked and laughed, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine he poured. The space, once so intimidating, now felt like a shared haven. After dinner, we sat on his comfortable sofa, a respectable distance between us, and talked for hours. He told me about the weight of his father's legacy, the constant pressure to be a part of a world he never felt he belonged to. He spoke of his own quiet faith, one that had little to do with the gleaming citadel and everything to do with small acts of compassion. He showed me his vulnerability, trusting me with the parts of himself he kept hidden from the world. And I, in turn, told him about the fear of dependency, of being seen as an opportunist, the fear of letting someone in, only to have them leave. I laid my own insecurities bare on the worn leather of his sofa, and he didn't flinch. He just listened, his expression full of a deep, unwavering empathy. Leo, he said, when I had finally fallen silent, my confessions hanging in the quiet air. My life, my resources, they are a fact of my existence. They are not a tool I would ever use to control someone. They are a context, not a cage. I want to build something with you. Not by you. His words were a balm on wounds I hadn't even realized were still so raw. He saw my fear, and he met it with honesty and reassurance. He was actively dismantling the power imbalance between us with careful, deliberate words. It was very late when I finally stood to leave. He walked me to the door, and we stood there for a moment in the same hallway where he had first offered me shelter from the rain. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I don't want to go," I admitted, the words tasting of a new, frightening honesty. "Then don't," he said simply. "Stay." The offer was there, simple and clear. But my old habits, my ingrained need for self-preservation, kicked in. I needed to do this on my own terms. I needed to walk out that door and choose to come back, not just stay because it was easy. "Not tonight," I said, and I saw a flicker of disappointment in his eyes, but he masked it quickly. "But tomorrow? I'd like to see you tomorrow. Away from here." He nodded, his understanding immediate and absolute. He wasn't pushing. He was respecting my boundaries, even the ones I was building out of fear. "Of course," he said. "My place. For dinner. 7 o'clock. He scribbled an address on a piece of paper from a notepad by the door. It was a residential address, not here at the Citadel. His home. "I'll be there," I promised. He leaned in and gave me another kiss, this one shorter, softer, a promise of things to come. "Drive safe, Leo." The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my small, quiet apartment. But for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like emptiness. The silence was a void where Julian's low voice should have been. I looked around at the life I had so carefully constructed, my fortress of one, and it suddenly felt like a prison. Doubt began to creep in, a cold, familiar fog. What was I doing? A man like me and a man like him? It was a fantasy, a brief, warm interlude before the inevitable return to reality. The light of day was harsher than the blue glow of the neon cross. The differences between us seemed stark and insurmountable. He was a Croft. I was a nobody, a repairman with calloused hands and a past I kept locked away. I spent the day in a state of anxious paralysis, pacing my small living room, my phone feeling like a lead weight in my pocket. I almost convinced myself not to go. It would be easier to just disappear, to let it fade into a strange, sweet memory. It would be safer. But then I thought of his eyes, the unwavering kindness in them. I thought of his words, a context, not a cage. I thought of the feeling of his forehead resting against mine, a moment of perfect, shared peace. He deserved more than a ghost. I deserved more than a retreat into fear. At 6:45, I stood in front of a handsome, understated brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was a beautiful home, clearly expensive, but it wasn't a palace. It was a home. It had a welcome mat and pots of flowers on the steps. I took a deep breath, straightened my nicest shirt, and rang the bell. He opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been waiting right behind it. He was dressed in casual slacks and a soft, dark blue shirt. He wasn't smiling his polite, public smile. He was beaming, a wide, genuine grin of pure, unadulterated happiness that made my heart ache. "You came," he said, his voice full of relief. I said I would. I replied, a matching smile spreading across my own face, chasing away the last of the morning's doubts. His house was like his office, only more so. It was warm, comfortable, and filled with books and art. It was meticulously clean and orderly, but it felt lived in, a true home. The air smelled of roasting chicken and something spicy, like rosemary. "I hope you're hungry," he said, leading me toward the kitchen. I might have gotten a little carried away. We ate at a small wooden table in his kitchen, the lights of the city twinkling through the window. The food was delicious, but I barely tasted it. I was too busy watching him, memorizing the way he looked in the soft light of his own home. This was his space, his sanctuary, and he had invited me into it without hesitation. After dinner, we ended up in his living room, sitting on a sofa that was even more comfortable than the one in his office. This time, there was no distance between us. I sat with my back against the armrest, my legs stretched out, and he sat beside me, his thigh a warm, solid pressure against mine. He put on some quiet jazz music, and we sat in companionable silence for a while, just being together. It was easy, frighteningly easy. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," he admitted into the quiet, his voice low. "I was afraid to," I confessed. I spent most of the day talking myself out of it. He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "What changed your mind?" I thought for a moment, wanting to give him an honest answer. "You did," I said finally. I realized that being afraid was my old life. And I think I want a new one. With you. If you'll have me, the vulnerability of the admission hung in the air. I had laid all my cards on the table. Julian's expression softened, and his eyes shone with a feeling so deep it was almost overwhelming. He didn't say anything. Instead, he leaned over, placed a hand on the back of my neck, and gently pulled me toward him. He kissed me again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no question. It was a kiss of acceptance, of mutual longing, of a shared future. It was the beginning of everything. We didn't move to the bedroom. We stayed right there, on that comfortable sofa, and explored this new connection with a slow, unhurried tenderness. Every touch was a discovery, every kiss a conversation. He was patient and gentle, his movements guided by a deep, intuitive understanding of what I needed. He made me feel safe, cherished, and for the first time in my life, completely and utterly wanted. The physical intimacy was an extension of the emotional bond we had already forged, a confirmation of everything that had been building between us. It was quiet, and it was profound, and it felt like coming home. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the soft light of dawn filtering through the living room window. I was covered with a thick, soft blanket, and Julian was sitting in a nearby armchair, a mug in his hands, watching me. "Morning," he said softly, a warm smile on his face. "Morning," I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. A brief, sharp panic flared in my chest. The morning after unease, the fear that it had all been a dream, or worse, a mistake. As if sensing my turmoil, he got up and came over to the sofa. He didn't crowd me. He just crouched down so we were at eye level. "How are you?" he asked, his voice full of genuine concern. It wasn't a perfunctory question. He really wanted to know. "I'm okay," I said, the word feeling inadequate. A little overwhelmed, he nodded in understanding. "I get that." He reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair off my forehead. "Leo, I want to be very clear about something. Last night was not a transaction, and today is not an obligation. You are free to walk out that door right now, and the only thing that will change is that I will be incredibly disappointed." His directness was a life raft. He was naming my fears and systematically dismantling them. He was giving me an out, which, paradoxically, made me want to stay more than ever. "I don't want to walk out the door," I said, my voice stronger now. "But I don't know how to do this." "How to be with you neither do I," he admitted with a small, self-deprecating smile. "It's been a long time for me. So, we'll figure it out together. One day at a time." "How does that sound?" "It sounds good," I said, a real smile finally breaking through my anxiety. "It sounds really good." "Good," he said, his smile widening. "Now, how do you take your coffee?" I laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "You already know how I take my coffee." "I know," he said, his eyes twinkling. "I just like asking." That first weekend marked the beginning of our new life. We took it slowly, just as he'd promised. A few days later, we faced our first small test. He had a fundraising dinner for the foundation, a stuffy, formal affair. He asked me to go, not as a command, but as a hopeful question. "I'd like you to be there, by my side," he'd said. "But there's no pressure if you're not comfortable." I was terrified. But the thought of him facing that crowd alone was worse. "I'll go," I said. He helped me pick out a suit, a simple, dark charcoal one that fit perfectly. He never once suggested buying it for me. He just came along to the rental shop and gave his quiet, approving nod. When I was ready, standing awkwardly in my apartment, he looked at me, his eyes full of a warmth that felt like a shield. "You look incredible," he said. The event was as intimidating as I had feared. It was held in a massive, opulent ballroom, filled with the city's wealthiest and most powerful people. I felt like an imposter, a crow in a flock of peacocks. But Julian never left my side. He kept a steadying hand on the small of my back, a constant, grounding pressure. He introduced me to people simply and without fanfare. "This is Leo," he would say, his voice calm and proud, leaving no room for questions or speculation. I saw some of the church board members there. I saw the way they looked at us, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. But Julian met their gazes without flinching, his expression serene. He was unashamed. He was resolute. And seeing his quiet strength, I felt my own fear begin to recede. We were a team. We were navigating this together. Later that night, as we were leaving, One of his father's oldest allies, a stern-looking man named Mr. Harrington, cornered us by the coat check. "Julian," he said, his voice a low growl. A word, he cast a dismissive glance in my direction. "Anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of Leo," Julian replied, his voice polite but firm. His hand tightened reassuringly on my back. Harrington's eyes narrowed. "This is an unwise association, my boy. Think of your family's reputation. Your father would not be pleased." I felt a cold knot of dread in my stomach. This was it. The confrontation I had been fearing. Julian's calm never wavered. He looked the older man directly in the eye. "My father's reputation is his own concern," he said, his voice dropping to a steely quiet. "My life and my happiness are mine. Leo makes me happy. And that is the end of this discussion." He gave a slight, final nod, and then guided me away, leaving the man sputtering in our wake. My heart was pounding, but I was also filled with a fierce, soaring pride. He had defended me. He had defended us. He had chosen me, publicly and unequivocally. When we got back to his house, I was shaking with adrenaline. He led me to the sofa and wrapped his arms around me, holding me tightly. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he murmured into my hair. "Don't be," I said, pulling back to look at him. "Thank you." He looked confused. "For what?" "For not hiding me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "For not being ashamed." He looked at me then, his expression so full of love it was breathtaking. "Ashamed?" he whispered, as if the concept was absurd. "Leo, having you by my side tonight made me feel stronger than I have ever felt in my life." In the weeks that followed, we built our life together, piece by piece. I kept my apartment, my fortress, but I spent more nights at his brownstone than I did in my own bed. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. We cooked meals together, read side by side in his library, and took long walks on quiet Sunday afternoons. He never tried to change me, never tried to smooth my rough edges. He loved me for who I was, the man with the calloused hands who knew how to bring light back to dark places. One Saturday morning, I was in his kitchen, making breakfast. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder as he watched me flip a pancake. "This feels like home," I said quietly, the thought occurring to me with a sudden, startling clarity. This kitchen, this man, this quiet morning. It was home. "It is home," he replied, his voice a low rumble against my back. "For both of us." He kissed the side of my neck. "I was thinking," he said, "your lease is up in 2 months, isn't it?" My hand paused over the skillet. "We hadn't talked about this, about the practical next steps. I have a proposition," he continued. "There's a spare room upstairs. It has great light. I thought you could use it as a workshop for your smaller projects, the glass bending and design work. And the other spare room, well, it has a very comfortable bed. Both are yours if you want them. No rent, of course, but you will be responsible for 50% of the pancake making." I turned in his arms to face him, my heart swelling in my chest. He wasn't just asking me to move in. He was offering me a space that was my own, respecting my work and my independence even as he invited me to share his life. He was making sure the power imbalance was never a factor between us. "I think," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face, "that I can agree to those terms," and so I moved in. The day I turned in the keys to my old apartment, I felt a sense of liberation, not loss. I wasn't abandoning my fortress. I was leaving it because I no longer needed it. I had found a better kind of safety. I had found it in the steady, quiet love of a good man. Months later, on a cool autumn evening, we were driving home from dinner. As we crested a hill on the edge of the city, the skyline came into view. And there, blazing against the twilight, was the Citadel's cross. A perfect, steady, unbroken blue. I looked at it, and I didn't feel the cold or the memory of the rain. I felt a deep, profound gratitude. It was a beacon that had guided me, not to a place of worship, but to a person. It was a broken thing that, in fixing, had somehow fixed me too. Julian must have seen me looking. He reached over and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine on the center console. His touch was as warm and reassuring as it had been on that first day in his office. I looked away from the cross and at him. His face was illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard, the silver at his temples catching the light. He smiled at me, a smile of quiet contentment, of shared history, of a future that stretched out before us, bright and clear. The differences between us, our ages, our backgrounds, our bank accounts, had not vanished. They were still there, facts of our lives. But they were no longer a chasm. They were just part of the landscape, the context for the beautiful, unlikely love story we were building together. I was no longer the man shivering in the storm, and he was no longer the lonely figure watching from below. We were just Leo and Julian, and we were home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.